It was the middle of November in the year 2001, deep in the heart of rural, agricultural Indiana. The concept of time feels entirely different than it does in a bustling city. Out here, time is not measured by traffic lights, train schedules, or the frantic pace of the news cycle. It is measured almost exclusively by the violent, cyclical turn of the seasons and the demands of the earth. By mid-November, the harvest is completely over. The massive, roaring, diesel-chugging combine harvesters have already swept across the vast, flat expanses of the Great Plains, violently stripping the land bare of its bounty. All that remains for miles in any direction are thousands of acres of skeletal, broken cornstalks that stick out of the freezing, hardened mud like shattered bones. In the isolated farming town of Cedar Creek, a community with a population barely hovering at 2,000 people, the sky during this specific time of year changes its fundamental texture. It hangs incredibly low and heavy. 4 weeks on end, the sun is completely hidden behind a bruised, unbroken sheet of slate gray. It makes the mornings feel exactly like dusk, and it makes the dusk feel like the end of the world. When the sun finally sets over these plains, there's a profound, almost oppressive emptiness to the landscape. There are no mountains to break the horizon. There are no hills to shelter the deep valleys. There are no skyscrapers to block the incoming weather. When the winter wind sweeps down from the north, it moves across the open, barren fields with a biting, bone-chilling hostility. It carries a distinct, sharp smell of frozen, overturned earth, the faint, lingering chemical scent of motor oil from resting tractors, and the looming, heavy promise of early snow. In 2001, the digital age had not yet fully reached the dirt roads of Cedar Creek. Cell phone reception was a rare luxury that ceased to exist entirely the moment you drove 2 miles outside the town square. Isolation was not just a geographic reality for the people who lived here. It was a deeply ingrained psychological way of life. People in Cedar Creek relied entirely on each other for survival, entertainment, and support. It was a town where front doors were rarely, if ever, locked. It was a community where secrets were practically non-existent because everyone shopped at the exact same single grocery store, attended the same brick high school, and banked at the same local branch. To vanish in a town like this was thought to be entirely, fundamentally impossible. There was simply nowhere to hide. For high school seniors, the Friday evening of November 16th was supposed to be a quiet, unbothered escape from the suffocating pressures of their final year of school. To understand the absolute, total devastation that was about to fracture this town, you had to understand exactly who these teenagers were. They were not just names printed on a black and white missing poster. They were the lifeblood of 4 different, deeply rooted families. Mark Evans was 18 years old. He was a remarkably quiet, deeply dependable young man who spoke far less with his words and far more with his calloused, grease-stained hands. He was not interested in academics or college applications. His entire world existed in the metal bays of his uncle's auto repair shop. Since he was 12 years old, Mark had been sweeping the concrete floors, organizing the heavy tool benches, and learning the intricate, greasy anatomy of internal combustion engines. He had spent 2 years of his young life, and every single spare dime he had ever earned, painstakingly restoring a 1993 dark green Jeep Cherokee. He had rebuilt the transmission entirely himself. He had sourced replacement leather seats from scrap yards 3 counties over. He was incredibly proud of that vehicle. It was not just a car, it was his sanctuary. In a town that often felt impossibly small, that Jeep was his ultimate freedom. His girlfriend of 2 years was Emily Miller, also 18. She was the absolute polar opposite of the mechanical, practical Mark. Emily was a deeply observant, quiet girl who viewed the drab, gray Indiana landscape in vibrant, emotional shades of charcoal, pastel, and watercolor. While Mark looked at a broken engine and saw a puzzle to be fixed, Emily looked at the rusted, decaying silos on the edge of town and saw a beautiful subject to be captured. She rarely went anywhere without a thick, heavy leather-bound sketchbook tucked securely under her arm. Her fingers were almost always smudged with dark graphite. She and Mark balanced each other perfectly. He grounded her in practical reality, and she showed him the quiet beauty hidden in the mundane details of their rural lives. Joining them that night were Mark's lifelong best friend, Leo Corrin, and his girlfriend, Chloe Vance. Leo, 18, carried the heavy, often suffocating weight of being a small-town sports star. He was a varsity baseball team star pitcher, boasting a fastball that had already drawn the quiet attention of a few regional college scouts. In a town like Cedar Creek, Friday night sports were a religion. When Leo stood on the pitching mound, the entire town sat in the cold metal bleachers to watch. But underneath the heavy athletic Letterman jacket, Leo was a deeply anxious kid, terrified of letting his father, his coach, and his town down. Chloe Vance, 17, was the undeniable caretaker of the group. She was a pragmatic, deeply empathetic girl who was maturing much faster than her peers. While other teenagers were planning prom outfits, Chloe was already taking grueling night classes at a community college 2 towns over, absolutely determined to become a pediatric nurse. She carried heavy medical textbooks in the trunk of her car. Chloe was the glue that held the 4 of them together. She also lived under the strict, watchful eye of her father, a former military man who enforced a rigid, non-negotiable midnight curfew. Chloe respected the rules. She had never, in her entire life, broken that curfew. They were a fiercely loyal, inseparable family unit within the larger family of the town. If you saw Mark's dark green Jeep Cherokee rattling down Main Street, its heavy tires crunching over the frost, you knew without looking that all 4 of them were packed inside. The school bell rang at 3:15 p.m. on Friday, November 16th. The sky was already beginning to darken, the gray clouds pressing down incredibly low over the empty football field. The temperature was dropping fast, hovering just above freezing. They decided to follow their standard Friday routine. They would all go to their respective homes, eat dinner with their parents, change out of their school clothes, and reconvene later in the evening for late-night food and a drive out into the country. None of these parents knew that these mundane, quiet, fleeting moments, a conversation with Mark about a car engine, a question to Emily about laundry, a thrown baseball in Leo's driveway, a stern warning to Chloe about her curfew, would be the final, haunting, agonizing memories they would ever have of their children. By 9:15 p.m., the heavy, mud-caked tires of Mark's Jeep Cherokee crunched loudly into the gravel parking lot of the Silver Spoon Diner. It was a local institution sitting just off the shoulder of the Tulane County Highway, a beacon of flickering neon light fighting against profound darkness of the Indiana night. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old frying oil, strong black coffee, and lingering cigarette smoke. They slid into their usual cracked, red vinyl booth in the back corner. The night shift waitress, a woman named Helen who had worked there for 20 years, remembered them clearly. They ordered 2 double cheeseburgers, a chicken sandwich, a massive plate of French fries smothered in gravy, and 4 thick vanilla milkshakes. Leo was loudly teasing Mark about the Jeep's sputtering exhaust. Emily was quietly sketching a highly exaggerated caricature of Leo on a paper napkin. There was absolutely nothing unusual about their behavior. They were not acting nervous. They were not looking over their shoulders. They were acting exactly as they had every other Friday night for the past 2 years. At 9:55 p.m., Chloe checked her watch. Her midnight curfew was a hard line. Mark gathered the crumpled bills from the table, left a generous tip for Helen, and they pushed through the glass doors, stepping back out into the freezing, wind-swept parking lot. By 10:05 p.m., the heavy rumble of the Jeep Cherokee's engine roared to life. Mark pulled out of the lot and drove south for about 3 miles before turning off the smooth, illuminated pavement and onto a notoriously remote, unpaved service road. It was a deeply rutted dirt path lined by thick, skeletal trees that formed a dark, creeping tunnel overhead. It led straight out toward the old, flooded limestone quarry. For generations, the quarry had been the unofficial gathering spot for Cedar Creek teenagers, a deeply secluded place to park, look at the stars, and escape the watchful eyes of the town. Helen stood by the greasy diner window, wiping the glass with a damp rag, watching the red taillights bounce over the deep ruts until they shrank and disappeared completely into the vast, suffocating darkness. That was the last time anyone saw Mark, Emily, Leo, or Chloe alive. When Saturday morning arrived, the sky over Cedar Creek was a blinding, cold, cloudless white. Mark did not show up for his morning shift at the auto shop. Emily's mother opened her daughter's bedroom door to find the bed meticulously made and completely untouched. Across town, Leo and Chloe's parents woke to the exact same chilling reality. Poor cell phone reception and flat tires on jagged gravel roads were incredibly common. A missing teenager wasn't immediately a cause for a town-wide panic. You assumed they slept on a friend's couch. You waited. But Mark was rigidly responsible, and Chloe had never broken her curfew. By Saturday afternoon, the silence had grown deafening. The heavy, sinking weight of genuine, physical panic began to spread. At 2 p.m., Leo's father, Arthur Corrin, couldn't wait any longer. He grabbed a heavy metal flashlight, climbed into his pickup truck, and drove the long, deeply rutted dirt road out toward the abandoned quarry to retrace their steps. He arrived just as the pale afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the ragged tree line. Mark's dark green Jeep Cherokee was parked neatly in the dirt clearing, just a few yards from the steep, rocky edge of the deep black water. For a brief second, Arthur felt a massive wave of relief. But as he stepped out of his truck into the freezing wind, the profound, dead silence of the clearing hit him like a physical blow. He walked slowly toward the vehicle. The engine was dead, but the keys were still sitting in the ignition, turned forward to the accessory position. The battery had been completely drained because the radio had been left running all night. When he cupped his hands and looked through the driver's side window, the unease turned to absolute, paralyzing terror. The heavy doors were completely unlocked. Inside, the cabin was freezing. On the center console sat the grease-stained paper bags from the diner, the food only half-eaten. Chloe's purse, containing her ID and cash, was still sitting perfectly upright on the floorboard. But the most unsettling, heartbreaking detail rested right on the hood of the Jeep, entirely exposed to the bitter, freezing elements. Emily's heavy leather-bound sketchbook was lying there in the open air. The freezing wind was violently whipping the thick pages back and forth. Her beautiful charcoal drawing of Leo was severely smudged, utterly ruined by the morning frost that had settled over the metal. Arthur knew these kids. He had coached them. None of them would have willingly walked away into the freezing Indiana night without their heavy coats, their keys, and their money. And Emily would never, under any circumstances, have left her artwork sitting out to be destroyed by the weather. They hadn't walked away. Something had stopped them. Something had taken them out of that car in the middle of the night. Arthur turned, sprinted back to his truck, and frantically keyed his CB radio, his voice cracking as he screamed for police. Before we delve into the massive, desperate search, the agonizing decades of silence, and the horrifying, earth-shattering discovery that finally brought this mystery to a close, take a moment to subscribe to Unsolved Case Archives. We believe in taking the time to unravel these complex mysteries, diving deep into the atmosphere, the forensics, and the human toll of every story, because these victims deserve to be remembered. If you appreciate long-form true crime documentaries that seek the truth, join our community. Now, let's return to the dark, freezing fields of Cedar Creek. Within 30 minutes of Arthur Corrin's frantic radio call, the profound, oppressive silence of the abandoned limestone quarry was violently and permanently shattered. The initial response was chaotic, driven by the sheer, terrifying adrenaline that only a small-town emergency can generate. The flashing red and blue light bars of county sheriff cruisers cut harsh, strobing patterns through the skeletal trees. By nightfall, the Indiana State Police had arrived, stringing bright yellow crime scene tape from tree trunk to tree trunk, establishing a hard perimeter around Mark's Jeep. Massive, industrial diesel floodlights were holed in, casting long, unnatural shadows across the deep, black water. Because the Jeep was found less than 20 feet from the sheer drop-off of the quarry, the immediate, agonizing assumption the command center was drowning. Perhaps one had slipped on the frost, and the others had perished in the freezing water trying to save them. By Sunday morning, regional search and rescue dive teams were called in. The conditions were brutally unforgiving. The water was a staggering 50 feet deep in the center, heavily polluted, and tangled with rusted barbed wire and sunken trees. The water temperature was hovering just above freezing. For 3 agonizing days, divers plunged into the pitch-black void, fighting zero visibility, dragging their gloved hands across the muddy bottom. But they found nothing. No bodies. No clothing. They were not in the quarry. While the divers searched, highly trained bloodhounds were brought to the Jeep. The dog sniffed the seats and the steering wheel. Suddenly, one of the dogs caught a scent. He let out a sharp bark and began pulling his handler away from the vehicle. The dogs tracked a strong, unmistakable path for exactly 120 yards, moving parallel to the dirt road, heading away from the quarry. And then, abruptly, the dogs stopped. They reached a slightly wider patch of gravel, sniffed the frozen mud furiously in tight circles, whined in absolute confusion, and sat down. The handlers tried to push them forward, but the dogs refused. The scent had not faded gradually into the woods. It had completely, instantly vanished. To the seasoned detective standing on that freezing dirt road, the behavior of the dogs painted a terrifying picture. The teenagers had not wandered off. They had walked exactly 120 yards away from their Jeep, and at that exact spot, they were put into another vehicle. They were driven away, 12 agonizing days into the massive, sprawling search. The winter weather took a harsh turn. A severe winter storm warning was issued. It was on this day that a chilling, deliberate clue was finally discovered. Nearly 7 miles away from a limestone quarry, on the far, isolated edge of a heavily wooded hunting tract accessible only by a muddy logging path, a local farmer found a piece of clothing resting on top of a weathered wooden fence post. It was Leo Corrin's heavy, wool varsity baseball jacket, but it was not snagged on a thorny branch or dropped in a frantic struggle. It was perfectly, meticulously folded. The heavy leather sleeves had been crossed flawlessly over the chest, folded into a neat, tight square, and placed dead center on the post. This was not discarded clothing. It was a display, a terrifying, silent, mocking message left by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. It was a psychological taunt directed squarely at the police. Despite expanding the grid search for miles around the fence post, the physical search yielded absolutely nothing else. The next morning, a brutal blizzard hit. 2 feet of heavy, blinding snow fell over the Indiana flatlands. The temperature dropped below zero. The ground froze solid as concrete. The search grid had to be officially abandoned. The massive diesel floodlights were turned off, plunging the quarry back into absolute darkness. Months bled into years, and those years slowly, agonizingly ground into decades. The story of the Cedar Creek Four transitioned from an active investigation into an open, bleeding wound, and eventually into a dark piece of local folklore. Mark's Jeep Cherokee rusted away in the county police impound lot. The parents grew old, their hair turning gray, their homes transforming into quiet shrines. The town of Cedar Creek withered under the psychological weight of the mystery. People moved away. Those who stayed lived with a quiet, lingering paranoia. Everyone knew the terrifying, unspoken truth. Whatever had taken 4 strong, healthy teenagers without spilling a single drop of blood was still out there, hiding in plain sight. Then came the late autumn of 2024. 23 years had passed. The county council finally approved a massive new housing development project on the far eastern edge of the county lines. The sprawling plot of land previously housed an overgrown, heavily fenced abandoned municipal maintenance yard that had been boarded up since the late 1990s. In mid-November, almost exactly 23 years to the day the teenagers vanished, a commercial construction crew was dispatched to the site with heavy earth-moving machinery to clear the dead brush. While tearing through a massive thicket of dead thorn bushes with an industrial bulldozer, a heavy equipment operator felt the steel blade of his machine violently scrape against something solid. He climbed down into the freezing dirt to inspect the obstacle. It was a massive, flat, heavily reinforced slab of poured concrete, buried entirely beneath 2 decades of topsoil. As the crew manually cleared the thick, wet dirt away, they uncovered something deeply unsettling. Set flush into the concrete was a heavy, rusted steel utility hatch. It was an old subterranean utility bunker designed in the 1970s to hold municipal water pumps. When the site foreman brushed the debris away from the heavy iron latch, he noticed it wasn't just stuck shut by rust. Secured tightly through the thick iron handle, locking the hatch from the outside, was a heavy-duty, industrial padlock. The foreman called the police. It took an angle grinder throwing showers of bright sparks and nearly an hour of grueling labor to cut the thick steel shackle free. When the heavy steel hatch was pulled open, its rusted hinges screaming an agonizing protest, a sudden rush of incredibly stale, freezing, foul-smelling air escaped from the pitch-dark void below. Inside the concrete bunker, at the bottom of a 20-foot rusted iron ladder, lay the skeletal remains of the Cedar Creek Four. State forensic recovery teams transformed the sleepy construction site into a massive crime scene. 3 grueling days, under the glare of floodlights, evidence technicians methodically extracted the fragile remains. Dental records and modern DNA sequencing confirmed it. Mark, Emily, Leo, and Chloe had finally been found. But when the official autopsy results came back from the state capitol, a chilling, Horrifying silence fell over the investigation room. Seasoned detectives had to step outside to catch their breath. There were no broken bones indicating a physical assault. There were no bullet wounds. There was absolutely no blunt force trauma to their skulls. They had died of dehydration, exposure, and asphyxiation, but the environment inside the bunker proved they hadn't crawled down that ladder looking for shelter. Wrapped incredibly tightly around the fragile wrists and ankle bones of all four victims were thick, heavily degraded, industrial-grade plastic zip ties. They had been bound. They had been forced at gunpoint down the iron ladder into the pitch-black, freezing bunker. And then someone had climbed back up, deliberately slammed the heavy steel hatch shut, and snapped a heavy padlock onto the outside. 4 living, breathing teenagers had been sealed alive in the dark earth. The discovery immediately shifted the dormant cold case into a high-profile homicide investigation. The FBI focused their entire weight on the single piece of evidence that had sealed the teenagers' fate, the rusted padlock. Advanced metallurgical cleaning solvents and microscopic laser scanning stripped away 23 years of heavy rust. On the bottom of the heavy brass casing, a faint, stamped serial number was revealed. It was a commercial lock. Specifically, it was the exact type issued exclusively to the Cedar Creek Sheriff Department to secure municipal gates and impound lots in the late 90s and early 2000s. Cold case investigators descended on the basement of the county courthouse. They pulled the original 2001 duty rosters and key logs. They cross-referenced the names of the deputies who had municipal master keys capable of opening the high chain-link fence that surrounded that abandoned maintenance yard. They looked at who had meticulously mapped the civilian search grids during the first frantic week. The overwhelming, undeniable forensic paper trail pointed to a single name, a name that made the lead detective sick to his stomach: Warren Hale. In 2001, Warren Hale was a highly respected, decorated, senior deputy chief of the Cedar Creek Sheriff Department. He was second in command of the entire county. He was the man who had drawn the maps for the civilian volunteers. He was a man who had explicitly, deliberately directed the K-9 units and the helicopters away from the abandoned municipal yard, claiming his deputies had already cleared it. He was a man who had sat in the living rooms of the victims' families week after week, holding the shaking hands of the weeping parents, promising on his honor as a police officer that he would not rest until he brought their children home. In 2024, Warren Hale was 68 years old, a retired, celebrated community leader with a comfortable pension. When unmarked state police vehicles silently surrounded his manicured property at dawn, the arrest struck Cedar Creek like a devastating blow. The town was paralyzed with absolute shock. The man they had trusted implicitly was led out of his home in handcuffs, his face completely devoid of emotion. Faced with the highly specific forensic evidence of the serialized padlock assigned to him, the zip ties, and the fact that only someone with his specific master key could have opened the outer gate to drive the victims inside the yard, Hale's defense completely collapsed. The horrifying timeline finally snapped into place. He had likely used his police cruiser's flashing red and blue lights to pull Mark's Jeep over on that dark dirt road near the quarry. The teenagers trusted him. They let him bind them, perhaps thinking it was a bizarre arrest protocol or a scare tactic for trespassing. He drove them to the yard, forced them down the ladder, left Leo's folded jacket on a fence post miles away to torture the parents, and then went to work the next day to lead the search. To avoid the death penalty, Warren Hale pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life rotting in a maximum security prison. But the closure the town of Cedar Creek had prayed for was entirely, sickeningly empty, because throughout the entire legal process, during every intense psychological interrogation by federal profilers, and even as he stood before the weeping, broken parents of the victims in that courtroom, Warren Hale absolutely refused to speak a single word. He offered absolutely no motive. There was no financial gain, no history of prior violence, no connection to the families. He simply stared straight ahead with cold, blank, empty eyes, refusing to answer the only question that truly mattered to the people whose lives he had utterly destroyed. Why? The families finally have a place to lay their loved ones to rest. The 23-year mystery of the Cedar Creek Four has been legally solved, but the dark, suffocating reality of why they were taken, betrayed by the very badge sworn to protect them, remains entirely buried inside the mind of a monster. Every case we cover takes time to research because these stories deserve to be remembered. If you want more cases like this, consider subscribing and let me know what case we should cover next.